In my time, I have created enough characters to give a mind flayer a headache. After building so many characters, you learn a thing or two. In this video, I'm going to be giving you my ingredients list to building a well-rounded character. With this checklist, you'll be able to go down it with your current characters to see how well-rounded they are, with new characters to make sure that they are well-rounded, and if you're a DM, you can test your player characters against it to find out what their weaknesses are to provide them particularly difficult challenges. Let's do this. Today's video was brought to you by the Wolves of Langston, a solo campaign murder mystery. Details will be at the end of this video. Before we get into this list, I just want to say that this is a broad strokes video, meaning that luckily D&D is a nuanced enough game that not every build is going to follow these rules. That's a good thing. Let's start off with our defenses. I really break this down into two different sections. We have our physical defenses and our saves. Starting with our physical defenses, we can really break this down into a couple of different sections. First, we have HP, then we have AC, and then we have damage mitigation, which is just a really broad section. First, let's start with AC. AC is how we resist attacks, and each point of AC we can expect to get hit 5% less often. Now, even though each point of AC is technically worth the same percentage, it is cumulative, so I do value each new point of AC more than the last. So for example, I value a bump from 20 to 21 AC a lot more than I do from 10 to 11, and that's because enemies have such a high likelihood of hitting the 10 AC that a 5% bump really doesn't change the game very much. However, from a 5% bump to someone with an AC of 20 changes the game significantly because it hurts those characters' ranges or those enemies' ranges. The next thing I want to talk about is how there is a direct relationship between your AC and how close to the front you can be. The characters who want to be frontliners need a solid AC because they're going to be attacked so often that they need mitigation. They need to reduce the damage with their AC. Moving over to HP, it has a very similar relationship to AC, but there are some nuanced differences. The first is that HP padding not only helps with getting attacked, but also helps with dexterity saves. Dexterity saves target your HP, so one of the ways to mitigate dexterity is just to have a ton of HP. There is a similar relationship to how much HP you have and how close to the front lines you can be, but overall we know how HP is. The more the better. We know how it works. If it goes to 0, you die, so you want a lot of it. And then we have the third category, which is the most broad category, and that's mitigation. Now, an example of this would be Barbarian's Rage. You know, you reduce bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing damage by half, you're mitigating damage. But there's a whole bunch of different ways to mitigate damage. Some are obvious like shield or mage armor, but some are less obvious like Rogue's Disengage. Rogue gets a bonus action disengage where they can run away. That's also damage mitigation. Mitigation really matters. If we look at a wizard, they don't get any armor and they have a D6 HP. Then we have a bard who gets their light armor and has a D8 hit die. They should be the more defensive character, right? Well, bards don't have anything in damage mitigation, where wizards have great damage mitigation in shield and mage armor. So wizards are actually better defensively than bards are. So when you have a character like a bard who doesn't have good AC, who doesn't have good HP, who doesn't have good damage mitigation, what do we do with them? That's where our positioning and mobility really comes into play. And I consider how you position a part of damage mitigation. So when I talk about bards, I talk about how we want to be in the back line, we want to be playing with our ranges, we want to be using cover, we want to be paying attention to what enemies we're facing and what ranges they like to play at, and to position in a way that counters them. That all comes down to maneuverability and mitigation in that regard. A cool note here is the higher your range is, the more positions you have available. There's literally more squares on the board that you can stand and still be offensive. So that means with more squares, you have better positioning options. So your range matters for damage mitigation too, which is pretty neat. The main thing I want to get across here is that there just needs to be a ratio of these three in balance with where you want to position on the battlefield, and all of it can come together for your physical defenses. So for example, a barbarian doesn't have good AC, but they have good damage mitigation and they have good HP. They can be on the front line. Or you have a paladin who doesn't have good ranges or very good positioning or maneuverability, but they have fantastic AC and HP, so they can be on the front line. Then we have someone like a rogue. Rogue has the ability to attack someone and then disengage, or they have the ability to do ranged attacks and do great damage output and then hide and get better positioning and not be able to be attacked. So rogues, they don't have great HP, they don't have great AC, but they have fantastic maneuverability, so they have a lot of flexibility on where they can be. I hope you're kind of understanding. You take those 3 elements, break them down for your character, make sure that you have something going for you, and if you don't, then you really need to be playing in the back line. Next up for our defenses, we have saves, and I'm going to break this down into the 3 big saves and the 3 small saves. What I mean by a big save is that it is often targeted by enemies. It's not how powerful it is, it's just how often it's targeted, and a small save is not often targeted. Now, every class gets 1 big save and 1 small save when you first take that first level that you're beginning the campaign with. So it was purposely designed this way. All right, let's talk about the big saves. The first off, and the most important, is the wisdom save. There is not a single character in the game who doesn't appreciate wisdom saves because they're common and devastating. Wisdom saves generally are resisting against the frightened condition, the charmed condition, and essentially mind control, you targeting your allies. Those are all really, really detrimental conditions for fights, and if you don't have a good wisdom save, you can literally spend whole fights attacking your own team. So not only are you worthless, you're less than worthless because you're actually killing your own team. That's why resilient wisdom is my most commonly taken feat at level 8 or level 12, because if you have a wisdom weakness, it is such an Achilles heel that I really try and pat out. The thing about wisdom saves is that they don't have many options for covering them. There are a couple spells like motivational speech or hero's feast, but overall wisdom saves don't have a lot of feats to support them, don't have a lot of spells to support them. So if you have a bad wisdom save, there's not a lot your team can do to help you until later. That's why I rate it the highest to pay attention to. Next is Constitution, and Constitution's interesting because depending on your character, it can be more important than wisdom saves, or it can be not that important at all. So what it comes down to is, are you a concentration caster? If you rely on very powerful concentration spells, then you don't want to lose concentration because that is super detrimental to you. On the other hand, if you don't rely on them, Constitution is basically just poison. And most characters who hurt from getting poisoned already have great constitutions. The exception is kind of Rogue and Monk. But overall, I'd say I rate Constitution the lowest of the 3 big saves. Unless I'm a caster, then I absolutely make sure I have a fantastic Constitution saving throw. And finally, we have Dexterity. Dexterity is super commonly targeted, and it's all revolves around damage. But the thing about Wisdom versus Dexterity is that Dexterity, it's a lot easier to mitigate, and it's a lot less devastating. Losing some hit points doesn't mean you're out of the fight. But you also have things like Absorb Elements, Danger Sense, Evasion, and as I said before, even just padding out your HP tough is technically mitigating your Dexterity saves. So for most characters, Dexterity saves are the ones I worry least about. Keep in mind that there are some builds where getting targeted dex is terrible. High AC, low HP builds, particularly that have no other way of mitigating it, really can suffer from Dexterity saves. So if you're building a character like that, you gotta watch out for them. Moving into our small saves. Small saves are interesting because they can be devastating, but they just don't come up very often. Charisma is gonna be my first example of that. Charisma can be campaign-changingly bad. Teleport you to another dimension bad. However, it is so often not targeted through your whole campaign that it's really not worth building around. So it's a really tricky one because if your DM targets it, you're pretty screwed, but chances of your DM targeting it are really low. Intelligence is pretty similar, but it's far less devastating. Intelligence, unless you're playing against Mind Flayers, you're probably never going to face. But if you are playing against Mind Flayers, what you can expect is it to stun lock you, which is terrible, but not as bad as being teleported to the fire dimension, or it might devastate your intelligence stat and you have to get recovered. If you're playing a Mind Flayers campaign, it's definitely worth taking, otherwise it's a pass. And finally, we have Strength. Strength is kind of interesting because it usually revolves around getting grappled and restrained. This also insinuates that it's going to be fairly melee range, so if you're playing your distances, you probably won't have to face many strength saving throws, although they are the most common of the 3 small. And if you are playing close, you likely have a good strength, and even if you're a wizard that gets captured and you have terrible strength, you still have things like Misty Step, which just completely negate them. So overall, they're not very threatening, except for when they are. So maybe you don't have that level of mobility. I'm thinking a bard, for example, who gets captured in one of these and then they don't have the strength to get out. Yeah, it can be pretty devastating. You might get swallowed in the next round. So there are characters who do have a weakness to it, but for the most part, most of the range of the classes you can be already mitigate it pretty well. Moving on to our offensive checklist, there are some things to consider. The first is your ranges. We have melee, short, which is anything below 60, medium, medium, which is anything below 120, and long range, which is 120 or further. That's kind of how I categorize it. Now, the nice thing is if you have long range, you also have medium and short range. So as long as you get long range and melee, you have all the ranges covered. Now, something else you need to also mix with your ranges is your mobility. For example, if you're a paladin with fine greater steed, you might be melee only, but your steed can move 100 feet around and then you can attack. So you still have a pretty wide range of area you can affect, so long as you have great mobility to mix with it. You take your range, you take your mobility, and that's kind of your area of influence. The next thing we want to focus on is crowd versus single targets. You want to have optionality for both situations. So you have a marshal. Most marshals really don't have a lot of options for crowds unless they have specific subclasses in monk, or rangers stand out as having the best options in general for crowds. But since marshals are generally terrible at this, that's why I value something like a dragonborn more on a marshal than I do on a caster class, because at least we have an option as a dragonborn for crowds at all. Whereas if you're a dragonborn caster, well, you probably have better options than your fire breath. Overall, you want to analyze your character. Do I have options for swarms, and do I have options for single target, high damage or high control or high something for single targets? This is where the caster and marshal divide is at its biggest. Casters naturally cover so many more situations than marshals do. They do have their place, but this is where casters really stand apart from marshals. And I also want to say that this is where the marshals who do have those options really shine. The next thing we want to do is we want to combine our optionality for not only crowds and single targets, but also for our ranges. So you also want to mix in, do I have answers for crowds in long range, melee range? Do I have answers for single targets at long range and melee range? So it all kind of starts beginning to get this chemistry going. Now, marshals, they don't shine in this area. Again, this is where the caster marshal divide really shows its head, but you do have grappling. So for example, you may be facing a character with really high AC, and you can sit there and try and break through that AC with your greatsword, but that's really playing into their high AC. But if you have a grapple game, you can grapple them, trip them, so now they're being grappled prone, so every attack against them has advantage, and now that fantastic AC they once had isn't looking so hot. So grapple game is really important for marshals. If you can get it, get it. Now, optionality for casters is a much broader topic because they have so many spells to choose from. So what I would say is you want to have optionality in that you want to target different saves. For example, you can have Tasha's Mind Whip. That's an intelligence one. Then you can mix it with Hold Person, so now you have a wisdom save. Then you can mix it with Maximilian's Earthen Grasp and you have a strength save. You take those three, and there's not many creatures in the entire game that you're not going to be able to target their weak save and absolutely handicap them. So it's fantastic to broaden your ranges of attacking saves. I just want to briefly talk about the offensive saves. We have intelligence, which is the king. Very few people resist intelligence. You have wisdom, which is often resisted but is powerful, so you still want to mix it in there. You have strength, which is surprisingly not very well resisted, and your effects are typically fairly good. Then you have dexterity, which is typically pretty well resisted. However, it always does damage, and it's usually AoE, so you can still get a lot of value out of it despite it being fairly well resisted. Then you have charisma, which is kind of middle ground, more often not resisted, but there's surprisingly strong resistance in areas you wouldn't think, and it is very powerful effects. Then you have the weakest, which is constitution. Constitution is very commonly resisted at really high numbers. You should really be avoiding it unless you have something that hits a ton of people with really strong effects. So that's kind of my offensive and defensive checklist. I could do a checklist for skills and roleplay, but for this video, I want to focus on combat only. Now, the final tip I want to give you for this video is don't be afraid to make characters who don't complete this checklist. I actually love making characters who don't complete this checklist for many different reasons. One, it's fun to have weaknesses, and two, it also really gives your allies a place to shine. You can be terrible at fighting crowds, and your character can have trauma from a time that they were swarmed over and were injured. So that makes them really appreciate the wizard in the party for being able to handle crowds for them, and that can be a discussion you can have. It can be great roleplay. Overall, don't make this a law in your game. Make it something that it's good to know, and so you can know when to break it, and then use that breaking in your roleplay. I think that's really great storytelling. Now, relying on your allies is all well and good unless you don't have allies, which I'm about to not have allies. I'm about to play the Wolves of Langston campaign. This is a solo murder mystery campaign, and I need to build a character for it. So in one of my upcoming videos, I'm going to sit down and build a character from scratch with you guys using this checklist. It needs to be kind of an investigator, so he needs to be skilled, and he needs to be able to handle a lot of combat situations. potions and different ranges and different situations, so it needs to be well-rounded. And after I have that character, then I'm going to play through the first chapter of Wolves of Langston with you guys. Now, if you guys don't want to be spoiled on Wolves of Langston, you can play it before me, you can play it along with me, or if you just love solo campaigns, you can pick it up using our link in the description down below. Should be a ton of fun. Hope to see you guys there. But with that, my friends, I hope you have yourselves an incredible day, and I'll catch you on the next one. See you then.